Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Monday, July 1st edition of Children's Lit, Shank's Children's Lit Zoom show. I'm Mr. Shank, and we are blessed with the presence of the kitty. Hey, look at the camera. There he is, Charlie, all his glory. Can you hear him purr? I hope his purring doesn't drown out my brilliant lecture. I'm hoping that you can still hear my golden voice over his incessant purring. But anyway, he's here. I don't know how long he'll last. Actually, I started to record this previously, and then he stepped on the keyboard and screwed everything screwed everything up. So I had to start all over again. So we're going to try it again, and hopefully he won't be too much of a distraction. A couple of things I wanted to do today. I want to continue a little bit our discussion of picture books and somewhat wrap that up, although I'm still in the process of going over your capsule critiques that you turned in for last night. And I've been very impressed by your answers to those so far. So I think as a way of completely wrapping up picture books, I'll be sharing those with you for our next class, the Thursday video. So we're going to move from picture books to our next genre, which is mythology, and under the umbrella of fairy tales, folk tales, and myth, but we usually start with myth. And I have some notes on mythology for you, including going over a list of what we call classical archetypes that we see in classic mythology, whether it's Greek, Roman, whatever the area, whatever the source is for the mythology. Charlie's on the keyboard again. I hope we don't mess up. The archetypes that we see in these very ancient stories, obviously these go back so many years. They're among the most earliest recorded storytelling. But what's interesting about them is that even though they're so old, they still are timeless, and we see them used today, and particularly in works that are geared for kids, particularly fantasy and science fiction. And I don't know if you were ever, a superhero fan, whether it was a DC superhero or a Marvel character. Almost all of those characters have origin stories. And as I go over the notes on myth today, and as I go over the archetypes, I'm sure you'll probably be thinking, oh man, I can think of a lot of stories with a lot of characters who use, or we see these kinds of archetypes in these stories all these many years later. In the 21st century, we still see them. And it's true. And I chose the Hunger Games as our primary example because it very obviously uses a lot of these archetypes and elements of the hero myth, which I'll talk about today. And, again, I'm talking as a potential teacher to kids in a classroom. It seems to me that, if I were teaching a introductory unit on mythology to grade school kids, Hunger Games might be a pretty good one to use because it does use these different classical archetypes. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to introduce that today, and then also go over the answers to the questions that I ask you to answer for parts 1 and 2 in the Hunger Games. And by going over those questions, I can kind of cover and discuss certain things in the story that I wanted to make sure we talk about. I'm going to save, though, the discussion about how we see classical elements and archetypes in the Hunger Games. I'm going to save that discussion for Thursday's video because actually your main homework for Wednesday by midnight is just that question, which is how do we see a lot of these classical elements and archetypes in the Hunger Games. So I don't want to give away too much. I don't want to give you all the answers. I want you to find those yourself. But like I said, it's not hard to do. Collins herself, Suzanne Collins herself, has said many times that she borrowed heavily from classical archetypes when she was coming up with the idea for the Hunger Games series. So we're going to talk about that. And I think that's the main thing we're going to cover today. I have a couple of introductory things I want to talk about first, though, before we get into that discussion. First thing I wanted to share with you is something I shared with you in email, but it is posted in Canvas. And just touch on this for a second. Again, here are the presentation groups for this semester. And I went by your preferences. And I was actually pretty happy and pleased that I think, well, I don't think, I know, everybody got either their first or second choice. And I think most people got their first choice. So I was happy to see that there was a wide variety of preferences, so I didn't have too many tough decisions to make. If you were given your second choice and not your first choice, as I mentioned before last week, my main consideration was to make sure there were roughly enough or the equal number of people in each group, so we didn't have, you know, like five, especially in a small group like this, we got 9 people. So I wanted to make sure we didn't have like 5 people doing fantasy and only 1 person doing picture books, or nobody doing realistic or whatever. But thankfully, it didn't work out that way. And as I said, I think just about everybody got their first choice. And particularly Grace and Kaylin should be interested in this because you are the first ones that will be due. So if you guys check out the syllabus, you know, after we cover each genre as a class, then the presentations will be due. So Grace and Kaylin, among other things, your presentations will be due by email by next Sunday by midnight. So you have this week to work on those. And then, as I said, we'll follow through according to the schedule. And after we're done talking about folk, fairy tales, and myth, then it'll be Lauren, and Tyara. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And then on and on. In regards to the midterm and final, remember I said there will be a question on the midterm and there will be a question on the final regarding the student presentations. So the first 2 groups of presentations you'll be responsible for the midterm. And then the last 2, I'll have a question on the final about those. So, you know, I will post the presentations in Canvas for you to read. And you guys are kind of lucky because, like I said, it's a small class. So for picture books, you'll only have 2 to read, and et cetera, et cetera. But you are responsible for the information in those presentations. Now, I don't spend any time in class discussing the student presentations. It's up to you to kind of read them. Now, this is different than an in-person class situation. The in-person situation is the students actually do present their works to the class. They come up in front of class and they share their work. Now, of course, this being online, we can't do that, but everybody is still responsible for reading everybody else's presentations. So there it is. If you have any questions, again, I went over the presentations last week, but if you have any other questions about your presentation or about your choice of work for presentation, or if you're a little hazy about the instructions or the directions, feel free to ask me about that. So those are the presentations. I look forward to those. Let's start our numbers in sequence, shall we? Let's start with the number 13. 13. All right. The other thing I wanted to do by way of introduction is to share with you something that's in the Canvas. And again, you're not responsible for this, but as we are looking at examples of picture books, and as the 2 students will be presenting picture books, I did this a few years ago, kind of by necessity, because if you remember, you know, the school year of 2021 was all online because of COVID. So again, we couldn't have student presentations as such. So I went about going on YouTube. And again, this might be a great tip for potential teachers too. You don't just have to read the picture book aloud in class and then show the pictures after you're done reading it and do it the old-fashioned way. There are so many great video adaptations of some of these stories, and you can find them on YouTube. And these are among, well, what I do in a classroom situation is usually I go to the local library and I grab a whole big bag of picture books, and I have some in my office. And then I distribute them to the kids in groups, and then they read the stories, and then they do some analysis. And again, we're not doing that in an online class, but these are some of the titles that we work with. And so anyway, I encourage you, if you want to, actually see the picture books perform. Sometimes it's just an individual like me or some teacher like me actually reading the story and then showing the pages or the pictures as they're reading. Sometimes it's more animated. Some of them are really very sophisticated and fun to watch. So if you have particular favorite picture books um, in this list and you want to see how somebody did a video of them, these are the links. Um, including, I tried to pick some of the recent Caldecott winners, and there are YouTube videos for that. So that's just kind of an FYI kind of thing. I'm not going to test you on that or whatever, but I wanted to make that available to you. Because again, we talk about, the physical act of reading, picking up a book and turning the pages and so on. And of course, that's still the primary way to do it. And it's probably still the most common way to do it. But now with technology and the internet and so on, and YouTube, I love YouTube. I can spend hours watching stuff on YouTube, and kids can too. You might as well make use of that and, show them picture books as done by a YouTube video. And again, if you're a potential teacher, this is kind of a nice way to handle the reading of picture books. Maybe you're not comfortable doing it, or you don't feel like you're professional enough, or whatever, your delivery isn't all that good, then you can just pop on the YouTube video and have them watch that. And so you don't have to do the reading yourself. So I thought I'd share that with you. The other thing I'll share with you really quickly in passing, there is a wonderful website called A Mighty Girl, and it is all about literature and pop culture designed for young girls and young women, and gives out recommendations for different genres, and gives a lot of good examples if you want to read fiction or, like I said, our children's works that feature strong female characters and role models for girls and young women. This is a wonderful website, and you can spend hours kind of going through that. But I thought, relevant to what we were talking about, this particular aspect of the website lists what they consider to be the top 100 picture books dealing with girls, obviously. And I'll just scroll down, and also, you can order these, you can buy them somewhere. There's a whole big long list of them. Also breaks it down into age appropriateness, which, we have talked about and emphasized. So there you go. And of course, there are other categories too. We're dealing with books and different categories, different genres for that. So again, I have it in Canvas, just FYI, if you're interested or you want to pursue that, if you have young girls in your life, or nieces and whatever, you might want to call this to their attention. And again, if you're a prospective teacher, this is a great source for information. All right, so that's just a couple of things, FYI. All right, the other thing I wanted to cover before we get into mythology is I do want to take a little bit of time to share with you the answers to the opening questions that you guys turned in last week. And I think this is a great way to, again, wrap up our introduction to Children's Lit that I hopefully tried to establish last week. And you guys did a great job of filling in the details and providing the examples of the kinds of things that I was talking about generally. You provided the specifics in your answers to this question. And so I have this in Canvas as well. And again, you're not responsible for this on an exam or a quiz. But again, I think it was a great way to provide specifics to the generalizations that I was making last week. And by the way, let's do a second number. How about 19? 19. Okay, Charlie's gone now. So you have my undivided 100% attention. All right, and let's go over those. Because again, I was very impressed with the answers. And a couple of common things, and I'm not going to read all of this, of course, but again, I encourage you to take a little bit of time to read everybody's responses to these questions. And usually what's fun is when I go over this in class, it's a classroom discussion kind of thing. And I ask, how many of you read a lot as a kid? And people raise their hands. And what kind of books did you enjoy reading when you were a kid? And I usually, it's a great way to kind of get to know people in the class because people will raise their hands. And I'll put the titles on the board. And what's cool about this assignment is, somebody will mention a title and then 20 other people in the class will go, oh yeah, I forgot about that one. I love that book. It was so wonderful. So maybe as I'm going through some of these, you'll have similar feelings. Lauren, and the other common thing that I saw, and I was very encouraged by this, is that most of you said that you did read a lot as a child and enjoyed reading a lot as a child. And that for the most part, you thought that reading and literature will still be relevant in the future as we move ahead throughout all the technology, et cetera. So that was encouraging. Some of you did mention that, as you got older, you had less time to read as much as you would have liked. And I think that's a common situation as we grow up. There are other factors and other things that play on our time, friends, peers, extracurricular activities, schoolwork gets more involved, et cetera. Sports, maybe you're in band, whatever, and pretty soon you just don't have enough time to do pleasurable reading like you used to. So that was a common theme I saw a lot. But let's go through a couple of these. Certain titles just kind of jumped out at me. One of the other things I love about this assignment is that as I'm reading the responses, a lot of them I'm familiar with, and I'll go, yeah, that's a great choice. That's a wonderful choice. And then others will be mentioned, other titles will be mentioned that I'll say, oh, I haven't heard of that one, and I'll make a note of it. And I'll check some of these out. So like I said, new titles are coming up all the time. And I learn a lot from this assignment, and hopefully you will too. Lauren did read a lot as a child. She loved Junie B. Jones. That's a series that I hear mentioned so much. Very, very popular series. The Gallagher Girl series, she loved that. She talked a little bit about her difficulty in reading, so that affected her choices and her reading ability. But she was read too. A nice list of different works that show specific benefits for children's literature. Um, Empathizing with other people's feelings and problems, wonder. I'm so glad she mentioned this. Um, I think if you put a gun to my head, and don't do that, by the way, it's kind of dangerous. But if you put a gun to my head and said, what's your favorite book of all the ones you do in children's literature? I'd have to say Wonder. I love Wonder. I hope you do too. Uh, at Night by Vizel as a work that brings history to life. I've taught that many, many, many times and will continue to teach that many times. Hopefully you're familiar with that one. Knowledge about nature, braiding sweetgrass. Now that's one I'm not familiar with. I've not heard of that one, so I made a note of that. Strengthen the bond between the child and adult reader. Shrek and Avatar, The Last Airbender were examples of that. I don't have time right now. Maybe later on in the semester, if I have a little bit of time, I'll give you my Shrek rant, my famous Shrek rant. So if anybody's ever had me for young adult lit or children's lit, somebody will bring up Shrek, and I go into an exaggerated outrage about Shrek. So, by the way, Lauren, I'm not failing you because you mentioned Shrek, but I got my eye on you now because you mentioned Shrek. No, it's kind of all in fun. I don't have time to go into my rant about why I supposedly hate Shrek, but maybe I'll do that another time. Um, and then she gave some really good examples of works that would fit each stage. Um, where the wild things are. Oh, uh, if we were doing an in-person class, you would have been gifted by my rendition of that. Usually I like to read one book aloud to class to give them an idea how they can present a work, and that's the one I always pick. And then again, she goes through a number of different works for each age and stage. I was interested to see Nancy Drew mention, back when I was a kid, back in, the dark ages, the Nancy Drew books were very popular for girls. And then, of course, the Hardy Boys. I read a bunch of Hardy Boys when I was a boy. Shreya, she read a lot as a child. And then she has some good examples. Strengthening the bond between child and adult reader. Oh my God, Goodnight Moon. Maybe one of the most popular books for parents to read to their kids. Bedtime stories. Are You My Mother? Learning the ways to cope with their own feelings and problems. Oh, this is a classic. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. And of course, Sesame Street. So good. Several generations now have grown up on Sesame Street. Bringing history to life, Number the Stars. Well, of course, that's one that we're going to be looking at this semester. Empathizing with other feelings and problems for other people, Bridge to Terabithia. That's one we're going to take a look at. Oh, and the Lorax. My big issue, I'm sorry, I'm kind of a one-issue person anymore. My big issue is the environment and climate change. And this book was written several decades ago, but it was kind of foreshadowing what we're doing to our planet. And I think every kid should read that. Fantasy, Adventure Worlds, The Golden Compass, Treasure Island, that's a classic. A lot of good examples here. And then she gave some examples of works from different stages. The Very Hungry Caterpillar, classic. The Giving Tree by Silverstein. I wonder how many of you are Shell fans. Diary of a Wimpy Kid, again. I'm sure a lot of people are nodding at that one. Tabitha was one who was honest enough to say that she didn't necessarily read a lot, but she loved Charlotte's Web, and that's good because we're going to do that. As she got older, The Outsiders and Lord of the Flies was read, and maybe some of you are nodding at that. And then she kind of went over some books for stages. Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. The Judy Blume books are very popular. A lot of good examples here. Yeah, later elementary would be the Judy Blume book. Am I Blue? As children transition into being teenagers, they may start to question their gender identity. Great choices there. Emma, did read a lot as a child. She liked the Aragon series. Um, let's see some of her examples here. Uh, Strengthening the bond between child and adult reader. I love you, Stinky Face. On the Night You Were Born. That's a great one. Um, Learning about nature. Chickens aren't the only ones. I'm not familiar with that one. I'll have to check that one out. Bringing History to Life, the Magic Treehouse series. Learning to cope with their own feelings and problems. When Sophie gets angry, really, really angry, that's one of the picture books that I always make sure I get from the library to distribute to a class uh, group to analyze. Excellent use of color in that story. Then as we get into later elementary, The Golden Compass, uh, American-Born Chinese, and then middle school, Harry Potter. You're probably old enough by then to start reading the Harry Potter books. Holes by Sakar, that's a great book. Hatchet. Um, Haley, she enjoyed reading. Um, some of the benefits here. Uh, Aladdin helps you go into a fantasy world. Of course, that's a classic. Great movie too. Peter Pan, Cinderella, Mulan. I think we have a Disney person here. Um, New knowledge about nature, the Bee movie. All right, so a lot of hers were classics here. Peter Pan, Cinderella. Good. Kaylin, love the Magic Tree House. Goosebumps. I think a lot of people would nod for that one. Junie B. Jones, again, mentioned a lot. Um, Hunger Games, Divergent. Um, Ellen Hopkins, which is an author that I would gear more toward young adults. I usually have students present works by her, but I know who you're talking about there. Much more serious issues discussed in her books. Um, Adventure, well, choose your adventure. Doesn't get much better than that. You get to choose your very own adventure. I think a lot of people know about that. Um, History, including the Who Was books. Understanding Empathy. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I was happy to see that mentioned. He's been gone now for quite a while, but does your generation still know who Mr. Rogers was? I hope so. A lot of great choices here. Fantasy books like Percy Jackson, Divergent, and The Hunger Games. Usually I have a number of people in both my literature classes who love Percy Jackson, love the books, and then almost universally hated the original movie versions of it. I guess though now they're remaking it as a Hulu series or something like that. So hopefully they'll do a little bit better job this time around. Vocabulary, the word collector. I wasn't familiar with this, but I definitely want to check that out because I think that's important to introduce kids to broadening their vocabulary, as we talked about last week. And of course, Dr. Seuss books does that. And then some classics mentioned here. If you give a mouse a cookie, let's see what she had for the later. How to Eat Fried Worms, Pay It Forward. Middle school, The Five People You Meet in Heaven. Very good. Gabby, she liked fantasy books. She remembers the Magic Tree House, Who Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus, the Bunnicula series, Chronicles of Narnia. I'm glad you mentioned that since we're going to be doing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Some of these have been mentioned already. Appreciating artwork. Eric Carle's works do that magnificently. Grace, also read a lot as a child. Love You Forever, Good Night Moon, Guess How Much I Love You. Uh, Great stories. Again, these are usually bedtime stories that a lot of parents will read to their kids before bedtime. Artemis Fowl, she mentioned in fantasy. That's one we didn't bring up already. The Book Thief for older readers. We're going to be taking a look at Number of the Stars as an example of a work that deals with the Holocaust, but is aimed at a younger audience. So it's not too graphic and too vivid, but still gives a pretty good indication of the danger of that situation. Jenna read a lot, loved books like A Magical Day with Matisse. She enjoyed the I Survived series, Strawberries Are Red, The Hobbit, Pan's Labyrinth. And then she had some really good examples of books that have benefits for kids. And then different ages and stages, as you can see. Olivia, that's a great one. Bad Kitty. Diary of a Wimpy Kid, very popular series. Where the Red Fern Grows. Wonder, again, I'm glad somebody mentioned that. Tyara, she remembers the Saggy Baggy Elephant. Now, I'm not familiar with that one, and the title intrigues me, so I want to read that one. Books that help them gain new vocabulary and syntax, Super Y and Martha Speaks, and Blue's Clues for stretching their attention span. That's a great choice. All right, so those are just a few of the ones that I received. Excellent job. And I thank you for everybody for doing that. And again, I was very impressed by the answers. And it's a great way to kind of wrap up all the things we were talking about last week, as in what are the benefits of good literature for children? What are the characteristics of great children's literature? And what are the different stages and ages that we're dealing with, and what would be works that would be best suited for each age and grade. And this assignment, you provided the answers. So look that over in a little bit more detail when you get a chance. I kind of jumped through it a little bit, but excellent, very well done. All right, let's move now to mythology. And there are some notes that I had you look over for today that I will now cover and talk about. And then we're going to take a look at the Hunger Games, at least the first two parts, and talk about that, but not give too much away, because like I said, the homework, which I will talk about and assign officially in a little bit, deals with you answering those questions about how this is a good work that shows classical archetypes. But to be able to answer that question, you have to know what I mean by classical archetypes and just general characteristics of mythology as we know it. So that's why I'm here, and that's why they pay me the big money. So let's get started on that. First of all, let me give you a third number. How about 35? 35. Okay. All right, a few general notes on mythology. And again, I'm going to have you read, and I have had you read in the Canvas packet, a little bit more about this in some detail. This is kind of an overview, and then I'm going to ask you to read a couple of articles that deal with it in more detail. So there's one article called The Value of Myths that you'll read in page 63 to 64 in the packet. Goes into more detail about this, but this is kind of an overview. A couple of important things to note about mythology, regardless of, like I said, what area of the world we're talking about, because every culture, every country kind of has its own mythology and its own set of stories. The mythology, obviously, that we're most familiar with would be Greek mythology. But then when the Romans kind of took over, then they had their set of stories, and it goes on and on and on to this day. So again, if you want a little bit more information, I am going to ask you to read some of the packet information. But basically, a couple of things about mythology is that for many, 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 many years, in mythology, these stories were passed down orally, not written down. And oftentimes they rhymed because, it was easier to remember the story if the lines rhymed, like a song, etc. Um, and eventually, people like Homer, I won't give you the entire history, but people like Homer began to actually write these down and record them for posterity. Um, and so that's, like I said, the kind of mythology that most people are familiar with. You can't take time in schools to teach every kind of mythology that there is. So usually a teacher will focus on Greek mythology, but just to know that there are other kinds of, there are other stories from other cultures that would qualify as mythology. But then the Greek and then the Roman are the most prominent and the most familiar. But again, remember that all cultures have their own myths. And as we're going to see when we get into folk tales, which are very much related to very much related to myths, but also have some distinctions. We're going to see that every culture and every country and every area of the world has its own set of folk tales as well. Now, why did we have myths? Why did somebody sit around a campfire or whatever and tell these stories and then pass them on from one person to another, from one generation to the next? Basically, these stories do three things if they're good myths. The first thing they were used for is to try to explain what they were not equipped to explain back, all those many years ago. All right. So I always give this as kind of a cliched example, but I mean, when a thunderstorm arose, and lightning flashed and thunder, they didn't have meteorologists at the time to explain this phenomenon. They didn't have the science. So they came up with stories, and the stories would help explain what they could not explain themselves. So, in the universe of mythology, we would say, well, Zeus must be angry tonight, or the gods must be angry up in Mount Olympus because we're getting lightning and thunder flashes. So they would personalize it in that way. And it would feed into their story and into their mythology. All right. So a lot of these stories, explain, natural phenomenon or whatever. And of course, we don't read the stories for those explanations anymore because in the intervening centuries, we've learned so much more and we know what causes lightning and thunder. So we don't think it's a god from up above. At least I hope we don't. I guess there are still some people that believe the earth is flat, but that's a whole other thing. So, we don't read the stories for a scientific explanation for things, but that was one reason they were originally told. Another purpose or another benefit of mythology is to teach lessons. A lot of these stories have morals, have themes, have lessons to be learned. And here's where, even though they're millions of years old and may not be relevant to today's modern day kids for a lot of different reasons, maybe still the themes, the messages, the lessons are still timeless, are still relevant. So, when, Odysseus goes through all of his many travails, and he finally gets home and defeats the suitors and, whatever. What are the lessons that we can learn at the end of that story? What are some of the lessons he learns throughout the course of the Odyssey and all the different things he goes through? So a lot of these stories teach lessons, teach us how to live life, teach us the difference between good and bad. We can learn timeless themes from these stories, even in 2024. So that aspect of a lot of these stories is still relevant, even though a lot of it is dated and can be debunked. All right. And then finally, this seems kind of obvious, but one of the reasons these stories have, survived all these many, many years is because they're damn entertaining. Um, they're fun to read. They're real page turners. And again, we'll get into the archetypes in a minute, but so many of the archetypes that are used are golden in terms of storytelling. They knew how to tell a story back then. So even if some of the aspects are dated and whatever, um, we can still enjoy them. We still want to see what happens. And a lot of the devices and techniques that were used way back then are used by authors and screenwriters to this day, playwrights to this day. They go by these ancient structures and these archetypes that were used to help tell modern day stories. And why do they do that? Because they work, because they're entertaining. The Odyssey, is a tremendously entertaining story. I mean, it does all the things I said, it attempts to explain the unexplainable, it teaches morals and lessons, and it does so in an exciting package. There's a lot of incredible adventure in the story. There's a lot of violence in the story. There's a lot of sex in the story. And all the things that we still love to this day in our works, and it's all there. And so, as I wrote in my notes here, the explanations may be dated, but the lessons are timeless, and they're still very, very entertaining. And I wouldn't expect you to teach the original Odyssey to a group of kids. Usually, the Odyssey, if it's taught at all in schools anymore, would be in high school. But there are a lot of versions that of these myths that are geared toward a young audience. And I put this in. I don't know how many of you remember Wishbone, was a TV character. I used to teach this edition in this class because I thought it was a wonderful way of introducing the Odyssey to children. It tells the story in very basic vocabulary. But again, it's very exciting and interesting. It downplays the violence, but it does describe, the Cyclops and whatever. And it certainly downplays, all the sexual adventures that Odysseus had. It's really a great, great example of what I'm talking about. You can gear this story to a young audience and introduce them to the mythology. And I think if they read this book, they'd like to read more mythology. Sadly, though, this book is no longer in print. So I had to stop assigning it to the class a few years ago. But again, you can get this on Amazon. Buy it for a couple of bucks. And if you're interested in looking at a really good children's version of a classic, well, the classic mythological story in my book, I mean, everybody knows the Odyssey. All right, so those are some of the basic points. I mentioned folk tales before, and when we cover this genre, it's kind of the umbrella. I said it's mythology, folk tales, and fairy tales. We're going to kind of put all together because they have a lot of things in common. They are distinct from folk tales, and I think the best way to explain it would be that myths are what we call polytheistic. And by that, I mean, a lot of the myths operate under the principle that there are gods up in heaven, or whatever you want to call it, Mount Olympus. Each god is kind of responsible for different aspects of our world, and led by one king of the gods or god of gods, who would be Zeus. And all of the stories in mythology kind of refer back to that basic premise. It's like, this is kind of a dated reference now, but it's kind of like one big soap opera. I guess General Hospital is still on. So it's like General Hospital takes place in Port Charles, and there are certain common elements throughout the story, but then there are a lot of different subplots in the soap opera, but they all relate back to this basic premise. And they're all sort of interrelated in one way or another. All right. So, for example, Zeus might make an appearance in any number of these stories, or Odysseus might, or Hera might, or whatever. So, they all operate under this basic premise and principle. If I have the book, I think I do. Yeah. Let me go to this real quick. I'll come back to it. This is a book I usually share in class. The Gods and Goddesses of Mount Olympus, and I can see it's backwards here. But I'm sure you're familiar with the whole premise. I'll just share a few of these. This is a great picture book that shows it. Kind of tells the story. And then here is Zeus. Hera was his wife. Hephaestus was the god of fire. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. These are Charlie likes Aphrodite. And then, I don't know, I could test you on this. Who's the god of love? It's Eros. The god of war is Ares. Poseidon, the god of the ocean and seas. Athena, the goddess of wisdom. So you have Hermes, the messenger god, shows up in a lot of stories. Apollo, the god of the sun. Hades, the god of the underworld. My favorite is the god of wine, Dionysus. And then this is a good representation, at least for kids anyway, of the umbrella of which all these stories kind of refer back to. Okay. So you see all the gods and goddesses in their glory right there. All right. And they would pop up in different stories. Whereas in folk tales, if I say, let's cover 20 American folk tales, right? Each one of them will be separate entities. They don't have anything in common other than the fact that they take place in America. Or if I said we're gonna cover 10 Chinese folk tales, right? They won't relate to each other in any way other than they all take place in China. So hopefully you can see the distinction there. Mythology has common elements that you'll see from story to story. Characters, gods and goddesses showing up in story to story. In folk tales, a lot of folk tales still have, the kinds of archetypes that we see in mythology, but they're separate entities. Yeah, so Paul Bunyan is an American folktale. So is Pecos Bill. That's also an American folktale, but they don't have any common ingredients or common characters other than that they both take place in America, which makes them American folktales. Go figure. So that's the difference. There's a slight difference, but that's the distinction. And we're going to go into the classical archetypes in a minute, but probably the most common and most popular of all the classical archetypes that we still see in so many stories today, including stories for kids, is the hero myth. All right, and you're going to read more about this in the packet articles. But basically, these are the qualities that we will see in the hero story. First of all, the main character, who we will call the hero, is most often, and again, these aren't hard and fast rules, they're not always true in every case, but most of the time, the main character is a human being just like us, who has failings just like us. So the ancient storytellers knew instinctively that audiences, listeners would relate more to people who they saw like themselves than if the character just started out as this superhuman person who had no weaknesses or flaws whatsoever. You can't relate to that. So they knew that way back then, and we know it today too. So, it's very rare that we have a perfect character show up as your main character. They're going to have some faults, some failings, some doubts, some fears, something that we can relate to. Often another common characteristic in these stories is that the hero's birth is somehow unusual or noteworthy. And I'm using Hercules as my example, but this is used in so many other stories too. And by the way, not to give too much away, but start thinking about how we might see some of these things in more recent works, including The Hunger Games, wink, wink. Another characteristic is usually as a child or as a young adult, the hero distinguishes themselves by some feats or accomplishments that set them apart, something that makes people say, oh, wow, this kid is special. And in Hercules' case, Hera was very jealous of Hercules because Hercules was the offspring of Zeus, her husband. Zeus, let's see, there's a lot of sex in these stories. Zeus liked to go down and visit Earth and have affairs with mortal women. So anyway, Hercules was the result of one of these affairs, and she didn't like it. Hera didn't like it, so she sent a couple of serpents down to kill the infant in his bed, and he ended up killing the two serpents. So it's like, wow, this kid's pretty special. Obviously, one of the main characteristics of these stories is that, the hero doesn't stay home and just twiddle his thumbs. Something causes him to leave his home, to go on some, and we call it any number of things. We call it a trek, we call it an adventure, we call it an odyssey. I mean, that's the origin of that word. And he ends up traveling to many, many exciting locations, fantastical situations, and has a series of tasks that must be completed. I guess I'm combining 4, 5, and 6. Hercules, in Hercules' case, was that he, at some point, he was put into a murderous rage by Hera and ended up killing his wife and child. And he was so mortified and so guilt-ridden that to atone for his horrible act, which he really wasn't responsible for, but he did it. He goes on a series of what we call the 12 tasks, and that's the basis of the story. How he overcomes each obstacle, each challenge, each danger. And what's cool about these stories too is that he'll do it in any number of different ways. Sometimes he has to outwit the opponent or the creature or the opposing force by sheer strength. Other times, though, he has to use his cunning or his wit to overcome the challenge. And there's a lesson to be learned there for kids. So usually, there's a series of tasks to complete or a series of obstacles to complete before they're allowed to come home or before we have some kind of resolution or ending or atonement for what they've done. So you'll see that in the stories. Throughout the course of their odyssey or trek, and again, here's where, the umbrella soap opera elements kind of come in. Throughout the course of the story, they may be helped by the gods and goddesses up above, or they may be hindered by the gods and goddesses from above. And we see that in these stories as well. In the Odyssey, Odysseus is opposed by several gods, but on the other hand, some gods and goddesses actually help him. So, and again, that happens in a lot of these different stories. So special childhood ends up going to many, many different exciting places. Like I said, these are very entertaining stories, very imaginative, piques the child's or the reader's imagination. They are sometimes helped and sometimes hindered by the gods, have to complete a series of challenges or tasks. And then ultimately they emerge victorious, or at least most of the time they do. And they their sins are atoned or they are recognized as heroes and legends. And in most cases, hopefully their actions have helped make the world a better place. And at the end of their lives, they are rewarded, often uh, become immortal after death. And we call these stories myths, or we call them epics and legends. And this all came about through ancient storytelling, the whole idea of a hero as your main character. And again, I will be asking you to read the pages about the archetypes. And then Seeger has a great article about it. And then Campbell, probably the foremost expert on mythology in the 20th century, Joseph Campbell, there's an article by him that will fill in all the different details about that. But these are the basic criteria, characteristics you'll see in a hero-based story. And again, as I go through these, we can apply them to Hercules, we can apply them to Odysseus, but you know what? We can also probably apply them to, I'll just throw a name out there, Harry Potter or Triss in the Divergent series. I mean, it goes on and on and on to recent times. And you might think about, the Hunger Games and Katniss and how some of this might apply. So that's the hero myth. All right, let me give you another number. How about 63? 63 will be our fourth number. All right, I focused on the hero archetype because it's the most prevalent and popular, because it's the most effective. It's the most timeless. It's the most entertaining. But there are other archetypes that we see that originate from mythology to storytelling of this day, including a lot of works geared for kids. So I ask you to look this over for today. So I'll review this briefly. And again, a little bit of introduction. Jung first kind of talked about this and called them archetypes. Archetype is kind of a fancy way of saying, certain characteristics that we see in these stories. And they can be anything. It could be an image, a theme, a symbol, etc. We see them in all genres, really, not just fantasy, not just science fiction. And then there are certain categories that we can go over. I just went over the main hero myth archetype, but we see in some cases the hero as warrior, the hero as lover, the hero as scapegoat, the transcendent hero who has the fatal flaw. I think you're all familiar with that idea. You can have the romantic hero, the proto-feminist hero. In all honesty, when we go back to classical mythology, I think most, if not all, of the main characters, the main heroes were male. But as time progressed, you saw, thankfully, more and more women take the role of hero or main character. So the female character can also possess all of these different characteristics as well. The apocalyptic hero, the anti-hero, the defiant anti-hero, all of these are different archetypes for the hero. There are different kinds of journeys and treks. I kind of focused on Hercules and why he has to go through his particular journey to kind of atone for the terrible thing he did. But there are other motivations for characters to start their odyssey, so to speak. So these are some of the types of the journeys that they go on. This is somewhat of a repetition of what I went over before, but there are certain stages. You might pay attention to this particularly, wink, wink, when we talk about the Hunger Games. But there's usually a departure where the character does leave their homeland to go wherever. Then there's stage 2, the initiation, then the road of trials, the innermost cave. And then at some point, the story ends with the character returning back to society or their homeland in some way. So I don't know, maybe some of these might apply to the Hunger Games. I'm just tossing that out. Other characteristics of the hero, um, a great list here. Um, so look these over and maybe ask yourself, how do we see these perhaps in the Hunger Games? Or maybe some, just ask yourself, what's my favorite movie series or my favorite book series? And focus on the main character and then ask yourself, you know, how many of these elements do I find in my favorite show or my favorite movie or my favorite book series? Um, Things like, I won't go over all of these, but a hero has a guide or guides, a mentor figure, so to speak. Or maybe they have this band of companions that accompany them. Um, Maybe at some point they make some stirring speech to their companions to inspire them. Um, the hero is often born and raised in a rural setting away from the cities. Um, how many stories start with that as a premise? The main character is an outsider. They're poor. They don't fit in with the rest of society, but for some reason they've been chosen to to lead and become heroes. There are situational archetypes, and I've mentioned a few of these already. The quest, the task to be completed, the journey to be undergone. In a lot of these stories, there's some initiation in the beginning that the main character has to pass even before they can begin their odyssey. Maybe certain rituals they have to engage in. Um, Maybe they experience any number of setbacks or the fall. In some cases, maybe they actually die and then are reborn in some way. Almost all of these stories deal with the battle between good and evil. I mean, what more common theme do we have in literature than that one? Um, some of them may show the unhealable wound. And then there are another group of archetypes dealing with the different kinds of characters that you're liable to see in these stories. And again, as I'm going through these, ask yourself, what stories, what's your favorite story? And how many of these kinds of characters do we see in the story? And I'm willing to bet there'll be quite a few. We've talked about the hero, but there might be initiates, there might be the mentor figure, uh, the loyal group of companions, the friendly beast, the shadow figure, the devil figure, the scapegoat, the outcast, the damsel in distress. Well, that's probably a more common archetype than fairy tales, uh, but we see it in mythology too. And we see it in modern day stories too, although sometimes now, in modern day times, the gender might be switched and it might be the male character who needs rescued by the female character. Um, Wink, wink. Again, I'm giving you answers. I'm making this easy for you. I should shut up. But anyway, um, well, another one, the star-crossed lovers. How many stories start with this as a basic premise? Two people who are so different who come from the opposite side of the track, so to speak. Or maybe they're not even supposed to be together. Uh, and yet their love overcomes everything. Maybe to tragedy. I mean, when I'm reading that plot, I'm thinking the first thing that comes into my head, Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare used this. Shakespeare used this. Um, and then finally, you can have symbols in these stories that are common in a lot of mythology, and we still see to this day. The whole idea of light versus darkness, supernatural intervention. Like I mentioned in mythology, it was gods and goddesses who would come down and intervene on behalf of the hero or the heroine. Well, we don't believe in gods and goddesses anymore in modern day. So there has to be some other kind of intervention or help that comes from somewhere that might benefit the hero or the heroine. So be thinking about that in regards to, well, particularly the Hunger Games. And then things like fire and ice, haven versus wilderness, heaven versus hell, the crossroads. This is basic storytelling 101. In a lot of stories, there usually comes a point in the proceedings, a very tension-filled moment where the character maybe is faced with a choice. Literally has two paths. He comes to a crossroads literally and has to decide whether to go on path A or go on path B. And the right path will be success and the second path will be disaster. And a lot of times the reader or the audience will know what the right path is and are literally screaming at the screen to tell the character which one to do. But they have to make a choice. They have to make a choice that could determine their lives or the lives of others. And it's a very tension-filled moment. And again, very effective storytelling. So think about that. How many times have you seen stories where at some point the main character, you know, has to decide what to do, you know? And then you have other symbolic things like the maze and the castle, etc. All right, so I thought I compiled all of these. I realize there's a little bit of overlap because I took them from different sources. But this is a really good outline of the basic types of archetypes that we see in mythology that have stood the test of time. And so we still see them in stories to this day. And it's kind of fun to talk about that. And again, I'm using the Hunger Games as an example, but there's literally 1,000 other examples, more than that, I'm sure, of how modern day stories, or even stories that are set in the not too distant future, like the Hunger Games, and like a lot of other apocalyptic fiction, looking ahead, dystopian fictions in the dystopian worlds of the future use these archetypes and very effectively. So there's that discussion. And so whether or not you ever had a mythological unit in school or ever learned about mythology, you've learned about mythology just through popular culture because we see these things all over the place to this day. All right, let me give you another number. How about 90? 90. That's our fifth number. All right, to wrap things up, let's talk a little bit about the Hunger Games. I ask you to read parts 1 and 2 for today, and I ask you to turn in the answers to the quiz questions for today. And I'm currently going through those, but and obviously when I'm finished grading those, I'll send you the grades for those. But let's go over these now, and I'm going to use them sort of as a basis for discussion to cover certain things in the story so far. And then I will ask you to read part 3 for before Thursday's class. All right. Most of these are kind of quick, short answer comprehension type questions. Number of year it's the 74th annual Hunger Games. And I think this is significant because as she points out, and of course, Katniss is the narrator, she points out that this is 1 year before the 75th Hunger Games, and every 25 years, they do something special. They call it the Quarter Quell. So this is the year prior to that. And I only ask you to read the first book in the series, but if you go on to read the other books in the series, book 2 deals with the 75th Hunger Games. And really, it's kind of an all-star version. They bring back previous winners of the Hunger Games. And of course, Katniss is one of those. And that takes the story in a whole new direction. So it's the 74th. Why do they conduct the Hunger Games every year? This is a great question because I think there's it's the official answer that the Capitol would give, and it's stated in the little speech that President Stone makes every year. But basically, there was a rebellion some 74 years ago that was put down by the Capitol. And ever since then, the Hunger Games has served as a reminder, basically, of the power of the Capitol. But also, they put a positive spin on it and they say, but it's also a reminder of how generous and wonderful we can be, because the winner each year is given, riches beyond their wildest imaginations. They never have to worry about being poor ever again. Um, so that would be the official reason for doing this horrible thing, which is obviously taking two children, and let's not forget their children from 12 to 18, from each district, and putting them into a competition to the death that everybody has to watch on TV. It's horrible. It's horrific. But like a lot of dictatorships and fascist regimes and so on, if you're going to do horrible things and try to get away with it, one of the first things you try to do is give or offer some kind of justification for it. So this is their official justification for this horrible thing they do. But the reason I think it's a particularly good question, I think most people probably answered the question in that way, which is correct. But I'll give you one other reason that a lot of kids miss, but I think is equally, if not more important, is that I think it's clear that the Capitol does this every year so that they can keep the districts hating one another, right? Divide and conquer is at play here, right? In other words, if I can get people from District 3 to hate people from District 12 or different District 11 or whatever, by making them kill each other year after year, kill each other's children, by the way, which is particularly horrific. We're not talking about adults now. We're talking about kids as young as 12. Then if they hate each other, they won't think to band together to come after us, the minority leaders who are vastly outnumbered by them. My God, if all the districts decided to rise up against us, we would have a hard time defeating them. And of course, that sort of previews what exactly happens. I won't give too much away. So there's a method to their madness. I always give the hypothetical situation. Let's say if they were able to communicate with one another, and of course that's not really possible either, but let's say the districts were able to communicate with one another, and let's say somebody from District 6 sends out the message, hey, everybody, we should stop doing this. We should refuse to take part in these games. What would the Capitol do if we all refused and we all rose up against this terrible regime? Well, if somebody from that district gives that message, maybe somebody from District 12 would say, I'm not going to listen to the person from District 6 because, a couple of years ago, somebody from District 6, killed my little sister, that's going to be a strong emotion. That's going to be something that's going to override. Yeah, I know what he's saying is true, but I can't forget the fact that my little kid was slaughtered by somebody from your district, and now you want me to join forces with you? Forget it. Very clever on the part of President Snow and the rest of the Capitol. Keep them against one another so they don't rise up as one against us, the 1%. I'll throw out a little recent kind of term for this. And the 1% controls all the rest. The reaping is obviously the ceremony in which they choose the boy and the girl from each district. This is significant because, of course, in this year's reaping, Prim's name actually comes up, and Katniss does something that apparently is not done at all in District 12, which is volunteer. We find out that in other districts, it's more common. You have, some of these kids are raised to be Hunger Games contestants, so often will volunteer. But in District 12, this doesn't happen too often. It's a real surprise, but she knows that Prim doesn't stand a chance, so she volunteers in Prim's stead. So very, obviously we wouldn't have a story if it went the other way. So that's the reaping. The name of Prim's cat, Buttercup, just to make sure you were paying attention. Usually I'll tell you, I'll fill you in, I'll give you a little secret. When we do this in class, I actually read out the questions and people have a second to write out the answers, and then we go over them. And I have a little contest, and whoever does the best job over the course of the quizzes wins their own Mockingjay pin. It's a very big deal. I don't have one at home here, or I'd show it to you. So some of the questions are pretty simplistic, but if you don't know the name of Prim's cat, then you're not going to win Shank's pin. So that's what happens there. We find out that each district is kind of responsible for contributing something to the capital, to the greater good of this, the ruling class, to keep things going. And we find out that District 12 is primarily a mining town, very poor. She describes the scene. Really part one is mostly exposition, isn't it? She kind of describes the scene and what kind of life she and her mother and her sister have to live. And people are so poor, sometimes they literally die in the streets of starvation. And they're coal miners. And of course, that can be a very deadly occupation. And that leads to question 7. Katniss's father is not in the picture in the story. As we get our exposition, we find out that he had died a few years before in a mining explosion. Number 8, this is kind of cool. After the ceremony, after the reaping takes place, there's no cheering, there's no applause or whatever. Instead, they do what we would call the 3-finger salute. I'll put it right out here for you. And that is what Katniss says is really the boldest form of dissent that they can get away with. Basically meaning they're showing their displeasure, they're showing they don't go along with this, but they stop short of anything outright rebellious or embarrassing to the Capitol, because that would lead to retribution, in some cases very violent. So that's the boldest form of dissent that they can manage. And if you've seen the movie, which is a really good adaptation, I think, of book 1, this scene is done really well. Sponsors, well, I'm going to give you one example of how we see classical archetypes in the story, so don't use this for your homework. But sponsors obviously are the people who are watching at home, usually the more wealthy who can afford to do this, who, if they like a particular tribute, will send something to the tribute in the hopes that they will be able to use it and help them survive. And the reason I bring up the archetypes is, I mentioned earlier that we don't have supernatural gods and goddesses in stories anymore who intervene and help in the hero's odyssey. But I think this is an example that kind of mirrors that. They are, in a way, people who are looking on and decide, I think I'm going to help Katniss, or I think I'm going to help whoever. So that's one example of a classical archetype that we see seep into the story. So don't use that for your homework. Careers, I just mentioned or made a reference to them. The careers are the ones who are pretty much from the wealthier districts, to whom competing in the Hunger Games is a great honor, supposedly, and they train for this. And not coincidentally, it's usually careers who win, because they're just stronger and well-fed and well-trained, and they can pretty much beat the poorer, less experienced, less trained competitors almost every year. Tesserae is discussed. This is an opportunity for particularly people in the poorer districts to gain oil or grain or something that might help their family survive. The only catch, of course, is every time they request this, they have to put their name in one more time for the reaping. And this comes up in her discussion with Gale, and Gale talks about how many times his name is in, And he stands a pretty good chance of being chosen, but he isn't. He kind of lucked out. I think it was 42 times or something like that. Um, Mockingjays, we talk about symbolic archetypes. Objects can be symbolic. The mockingjay will become one of the central, if not the central symbol in the entire series of books. And mockingjays were created after the Capitol created jabberjays as a way of, you know, uh, spying on the populace. You know, jabberjays would hear everything that was said and report back to the Capitol about, it was a way of spying basically. And the experiment really didn't work very well, but there were still jabberjays, and they mated with mockingbirds, and then you ended up with mockingjays. How did Katniss get the Mockingjay pin? Well, if you've seen the movie's a little bit different. She gets it at the Hob, but in the book, she gets it from the mayor's daughter, and of course, she then passes it on to Prim as a good luck token. Some good luck. I always kind of laugh at this. You know, Prim ended up being. I always laugh when Katniss says, "Yeah, as long as you wear this, nothing bad will happen to you." Well, you got chosen by the Hunger Games anyway. So Prim then, of course, gives it back to her, and it becomes her talisman as a way of kind of getting through the games. Um, what did she do to impress the game makers? A great scene in the movie. They kind of disregard her and not pay attention to her. It's kind of at the end of the day, and everybody has a chance to try out. So she sticks an arrow right through the apple in the pig's mouth where they were standing, and that got their attention. And apparently, they have at least some sense of humor. Um, and they gave her a high score. And the whole purpose of this is to kind of show who the favorites are, so to speak, before the games begin. Because remember, you can bet on these too. I mean, all the people in the in Panem, you know, can bet for their favorites. I'm sure they have odds, and you know, Katniss became one of the favorites. It's kind of like a way of calling attention to her. Hey, that girl from District 12. Hey, you know, she's pretty good. All right, and then they have, you know, the opening ceremonies where they all come out to be introduced, and you know, and again, remember, all of this is on TV, and of course, she is the girl on fire, the girl on fire. So um, she has this dress made out of fire that gains everybody's attention, and again, it's another way to call attention to her. Hey, this is going to be different. This is going to you know, she has a chance maybe. All right, so that pretty much ends part one. A lot of exposition, a lot of description of what life is like in Panem, and particularly District 12. And then part two begins, you know, right before they are set to begin the games the night before, and Peeta and Katniss are kind of on the roof contemplating their fate. And the topic comes up, you know, we could just jump off this roof and end it all and die relatively painlessly instead of facing whatever horrors that we're liable to face starting tomorrow. But I think the reason I asked this question, I think it's interesting. This is the 74th games. And I got the sense, you know, Katniss is the narrator, so there's a lot of stuff that she can't tell us behind the scenes. But you kind of get the idea through different details of her narration that over the years, the Capitol has sort of perfected, so to speak, the Hunger Games. You know, they want a good show. And you just get the idea that there were probably previous years where, uh, you know, some of the tributes decided to take that route, you know, decided to kill themselves instead of going through what they were going to face in the Hunger Games. And of course, if people do that, then there's no show. So you get the idea that there probably was somebody some year who actually jumped off the roof to end it all. And they said, well, we got to make sure that doesn't happen again. So they have this force field that keeps them from hitting the ground. So they bring that up. And I think that's an interesting little detail in the conversation. The cornucopia is where all the supplies are. And again, a little bit of outside help from outside forces. So right after they get off the platform, right in front of the wooded area is this cornucopia. And actually Haymitch, who we'll talk more about, but he's like my favorite character. I can relate to Haymitch on different levels. But Haymitch, really wasn't too much help to them, but he actually does give them one bit of advice that was helpful. He said, after you get off the platform, do not go for the cornucopia because, that's where there's a bloodbath. The first opening moments of the Hunger Games, people go for the all the supplies in the all the supplies in the cornucopia, and that's where a lot of kids get killed. So go run away from it. And actually, PETA takes his advice, but Katniss doesn't, and almost does get killed that very first day. So that's kind of significant. Again, I'm going to give you another answer to the homework that I don't want you to use since I'm going over it. Almost always in classical mythology, the main character never starts the journey empty-handed. They usually have something, a weapon or something that they carry with them that will hopefully help them survive in whatever it is they're about to face. And in Katniss's case, that's true as well. She has a little backpack or knapsack or whatever you want to call it that has any number of things, night vision goggles. She has an empty water bottle. She has some rope. She has all kinds of things. And, this is storytelling 101 as well. Usually if a character starts out with certain, whatever you want to call it, certain images or certain things that they can use that will help them, usually in the course of the story, they will be used. So it's kind of foreshadowing. So it's kind of like, oh, she's got some rope. How's she going to use that? She's got an empty water bottle. How's she going to use that? Just some iodine, whatever it is. Okay. So there's a little bit of foreshadowing there as well. All right. Tracker jackers are not something we see in our world, but we do see it in the Hunger Games. These are deadly genetically mutated wasps that if you are stung a few times, you can have hallucinations. And if you're stung multiple times, it can cause death. And again, this is a little bit of foreshadowing because eventually we will see one of the tributes die as a result of that. How do they know a tribute has been killed? Well, actually, there's two ways. Either the cannon goes off immediately, because remember, all this is being televised, but the contestants can't see what's going on. So this is how they find out, if somebody's been killed. The cannon goes off immediately, and then at the end of the day, they will flash up into the sky the images of the tributes that have been killed that day. This is a question that usually gets people, at least in class, you maybe had a chance to look it up. But 11 people, 11 kids, and then again, we cannot overlook the idea that we're talking about children here. Oh, by the way, let me give you another number here, 99, our sixth number. 11, that's almost half. And again, a lot of them died at the cornucopia because they did not, heed or understand the warning that was given by Haymitch. So they went ahead and tried to get as many supplies as they could, and that led to the bloodbath. All right, in part two, we see that she has any number of qualities and skills that might hold her in pretty good stead. We know she's good with a bow and arrow, but she also knows some very important things like how to find water. You might have mentioned that. She knows how to climb trees. She knows how to hunt. She uses a snare, for example, to catch a rabbit for dinner. All right, number 23 is an important scene. When does Katniss question Peeta's loyalty to her? This is the scene where, she's up in the tree and she's trying to get away from Cato and some of the other careers. And by this time, Peeta has joined them, or they have joined Peeta, however you want to put it. And, the question usually arises, why is Peeta with them? And that's the question she has when she sees them with him, or she sees him with them, I should say. And, if you think about it, it's pretty clear. They could have killed him easily, but I think they wanted him around because they wanted to lure her out. She's the real challenge. She's the real threat to them. So I think that's why they let him kind of hang around. But when she sees him with them, for a moment, for a brief time in the story, she questions his loyalty. And it shakes her up. But again, he will go on to prove his loyalty when he kind of saves her a little bit later on. The first gift she receives from a sponsor is the broth. Excuse me, I got a frog in my throat. Excuse me, I still have a little. So the first gift that she received, and you must have, this is storytelling 101 too. We find out that, sponsors can give gifts to tributes if they are following them and are pulling for them. And so somebody is pulling for Katniss apparently and sends her that ointment as a gift. Let me put this back up again. And it won't be the first, but that is the first thing that she gets that's very helpful to her. All right. The games are in pretty much full swing now. And there are only a few, relative few tributes left. So the ones that are left, we even get to know by name. And one of them is Glimmer. And the question is, how is Glimmer killed? And this is a very important scene in part 2. This is where Katniss was up in the trees along with Rue, and she cuts the branch that had the tracker jackers who were introduced earlier as kind of a foreshadowing. And the hive falls down on everybody, including Peeta, and they all go running off. But Glimmer wasn't fast enough, and she is stung multiple times until she's fatally stung. And of course, the significance of this episode is that she had the bow and arrow. Glimmer had a bow and arrow, and now Katniss has it. So now she has the weapon that she is most adept at. So we have to feel like maybe her chances have just gotten much, much better. So this is a key moment, obviously, for her. So Glimmer had the bow and arrow, but was killed by the tracker jackers, and Katniss now has the bow and arrow. Very significant development. At some point, and she's talking to Rue here because they have kind of joined forces. At one point, she says to Rue, if we're going to win this thing, we have to take the offensive. We can't just wait for them to come to get us. We have to take the offensive. And remember, every year they show these Hunger Games. So if you watch them, maybe you'll learn a few things. And one of the things Katniss remembered from years past, she said about the only time careers don't win these games is when they don't have access to supplies. So we got to take care of their supplies. So she sets up a system where there are a number of mines around the supplies, and she is able to come up with this plan to explode the mines around their supplies and destroy their supplies. And Rue helps her a little bit. But unfortunately, Rue is killed by one of the tributes remaining, who then Katniss kills. And a very poignant scene, and this is very well done in the movie as well. Rue's last request, and actually I actually take 2 answers for this because I'm kind of lenient. There is one definite last thing she says before she dies. Sometimes students say, well, her request was to win. I want you to win. You have to win, Katniss. So I guess that could be a request. But the very last thing she asks is for Katniss to sing to her, which Katniss will do. A very powerful, moving scene. And as a result of that, a very symbolic scene in the book After Katniss, who had become very close to Rue, probably saw her as like a little sister substitute, probably saw a lot of Prim in Rue. Just a little girl who really didn't stand much of a chance, although she hung on for a while because she was good at being in the trees. But, after, she's very devastated by Rue's death, she actually provides a little bit of a funeral service with her, covers her in flowers and so on. And this, again, this is watched all around the Capitol and all around Panem. And the people from District 11, where Rue came from, were suitably moved. This is a very poor district, just as poor, if not poorer, than District 12. They send her something. And again, it's a symbolic gesture. It's not going to help her much in the games, but it is a loaf of bread. Um, we'll talk more about the symbolic meaning of bread when we wrap up the book, talk about the ending on Thursday. But also, this is kind of leads to one of the main differences between the movie and the book. In the book, like I said, they send her a loaf of bread as a token of their appreciation for the care that she gave to Rue. In the movie, it's much more dramatic. They actually show scenes of the people in District 11 rebelling and revolting against the peacekeepers. And for a while they kind of get the upper hand, but of course they are totally outnumbered and they're totally squashed, and it's kind of a violent scene. So it's much more dramatic and violent in the movie than it is in the book. I'll leave you to determine whether you think which example you think is more effective. I kind of liked the movie. It was actually a little bit more, it was more dramatic and shows that, she's starting to plant the seeds of the revolution. And by the way, it couldn't have made the Capitol too happy to see people from one district send something to somebody from another district. Because again, that goes against what I was talking about early on. We want them hating one another. We want them to be against one another. We don't want them to feel empathy for another tribute in another district. And yet this is the seed. Like I said, it's very symbolic. A loaf of bread is not going to help her much, but the impact of that, what that means, cannot be overstated. All right. Well, at the very end of book 2, the Capitol can do whatever they want, and we see this again and again and again. And one of the things they decide to do is something they've never done before. And they announce a rule change at the end, which is that there can be 2 winners of the Hunger Games, which they've never allowed before, as long as the 2 come from the same district. All right. And I usually ask in class, I'll ask you kind of metaphorically, why do you suppose that the Capitol would institute this rule change? And there's basically, I think, 2 answers to this. One is the maybe more obvious one. Apparently, the star-crossed lovers thing that's going on between Katniss and Peeta, whether it's real or not, I think it's real on his part. On her part, she doesn't love him immediately. We'll talk more about that later. So that's playing really well. But the people at home, they want to see that, and they would like to see the 2 people in love maybe survive. So at least in terms of popularity and rate, well, everybody's got to watch it. They're kind of forced to, but it's very popular. This idea is very popular. I think the more subtle and maybe the more important reason is because I think by this point they see Katniss as a real threat and they want her eliminated. And as long as you have the 2 tributes, Cato and the other tribute alive, and they can still win as well, is kind of 2 against 1. I don't think they're worried about Peeta. So I think, there's a better chance of them being, I'm sorry, there's a better chance of Katniss being eliminated in this rather than her being on her own and not having to worry about Peeta. And I think that's probably part of the mindset behind that. Okay. So Clove and Cato, are still around, and they're both formidable. They're both careers. So they probably have a better chance staying together and surviving and getting rid of Katniss than the other way around. So I think that played a part in their rationale as well. And then finally, just to see if you were paying attention to my lectures, the name of my cat is Charlie. So those are the answers to the Hunger Games quiz questions. And I wanted to go over those because I think they do touch on certain things that I wanted to cover as far as the first two parts of the book. All right, so that ends my lecture. Let me give you one more number here. How about 78? 78 will be our last number. All right, let me end by explaining what I want you to do before the next class. And again, this will be posted in Canvas. This is posted in Canvas. All right. So here are the assignments that are due by Wednesday by midnight. Obviously, watch this lecture. Take note of the numbers and sequence that I gave you. I do want you to finish reading The Hunger Games, so read part 3. There are Canvas readings that I'd like you to read. Here are the files that I want you to read. Whoops, we got to misspell a word here. That bothers me as a literature teacher. All right, so read part 3, then the Canvas files. We're going to talk a little bit about not only how the work shows examples of classical archetypes, but also it's a good example of dystopian fiction. So that's another concept that you might want to introduce to kids as they're reading. There's a file called Hunger Games Myth Connections. Read that. Katniss Everdeen is my hero. And the article, 5 Lessons in Human Goodness. And then this is the 30-point quiz that I'm going to ask you to complete. So send it to me by email before midnight on Wednesday with the numbers in sequence. Here's Charlie with his favorite actress. And then I'll go real quick to all right, so these are the questions I'd like you to answer. Again, first of all, answer some short answer comprehension questions for part 3. So there are 17, and those you can answer in a word or a phrase. And then here are the analysis questions. What would be the age appropriateness for this series? So explain your answer to that. I think there are a number of things that are being criticized in today's society. So what are some things that you see, most dystopian works are commentaries on things that are happening in our world. Give an example of each of the kinds of conflict in the story. Since you're going to be reading up on dystopian fiction, what are some qualities of dystopian fiction you see in the work? Now, here's the key question. What are at least 5 mythological conventions that we see in the Hunger Games? These are the kinds of things I went over today. But don't use the ones that came up in our discussion. Number 6, can you list some other examples for kids that use classical archetypes? You can just list them. You don't have to explain your titles. Number 7, real quick, do you have any criticisms of the novel? You didn't have to love it. And then finally, number 8, what qualities do you think make Katniss a good role model for young girls? Just list them. And then can you think of other fictional female characters, particularly for young girls, that you would consider to be good role models? And you can take these from novels and TV shows and movies and pop culture. Okay? So that is the homework for class. And then I will, even though it is July 4th, I will publish a video on that Thursday that will kind of go over what we're assigning, and then I'll explain what's due for the following Sunday into Monday of next week. Okay, so we're going to maintain the schedule, even though obviously um, you'll probably be doing other things on Thursday. Uh, More than likely, well, I was going to say I might post the video on Wednesday night, but we'll see to give you some extra time. But anyway, when we next meet, I'll have the regular Thursday video for you. All right, I guess that's it. Thanks for sticking with me. If you have any questions, obviously, let me know. Make sure you email me your assignments with the numbered sequence and to get credit for it. And have a wonderful beginning of your week. And we will see you. The video will be posted on the 4th. So happy Independence Day. Thank you all.